Three, two, one.
We'd like to welcome you to another edition of GrokTALK, brought to you by New Hampshire's leading conservative blog site, GrokTALK.com. We are your feared, extremist, right-wing, hard-charging, gun-toting, opinionated, outspoken, rabble-rousing, letter-writing, radio microphone stomping conservatives and rational libertarians. So get ready for more news and opinion you could only get from GrokTALK.com.
GrokTALK.
Government does not cease to be destructive because the men in charge carry an R after their names, and the willingness of many conservatives to abandon principles the very moment they wrapped their grubby hands around the levers of power has contributed to a reasonable suspicion that the right's objection to the use of government as an agent of social change is situational. Welcome back to GrokTALK. That's from Charles C.W. Cook from his new book, The Conservatarian Manifesto. I highly recommend it, and I'm only about a third of the way through it.
Yes, I saw that announced on National Review. It looks like it's a great book. I'm hearing good things about it. You'll have to give us a blow-by-blow. It's sort of as we were discussing in the, when we first got here. Sounds like another Jonah Goldberg kind of book where every other line gets underlined.
I would guess, when I first started reading it, I was thinking about, what's his name, Codevilla, or...
Yeah, Codevilla.
Angelo Codevilla.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of that. You know, it's supposed to be a shout-out to the conservatives and the conservatarians about how they're going about it wrong. Mm-hmm. You know, so...
how say?
I haven't gotten to that part yet.
Oh, okay. You're a third of the way booking.
It's only 176 pages. But
So are you going to post a picture of the book with a review, and do you want me to munge the link for you? So
sure.
Phone
call. Phone call.
We're ringing.
Hang on.
This is GrokTALK. This is Skip Murphy. How are you? Oh, nice to have you on. We're going to bring you on live in just a second here with the rest of us. I have Steve McDonald and Mike Rogers with me here at GrokTALK. And thanks for taking a few minutes with us from your layover.
All right, we have Senator Ted Cruz on the phone. Senator, good morning.
Good morning. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much for
sir.
taking some time to be with us as Skip messes around with this microphone. All right, questions.
My first question is, as I talked to one of your folks last night, is that we like to ask questions of the day and then drive down into the principles from which we should be talking about. And that's the letter that you signed that went to the Iranian mullahs, the 47 senators that signed along with you. And my question is, did it get the expected result you were hoping for? And why did you, from constitutional standpoint, actually write that letter and sign it?
Well, unfortunately, we've seen for 6 years President Obama and his administration disregarding federal law and disregarding the Constitution. When it comes to this Iranian deal, the president seems bound and determined to go down the road of signing a bad deal. I believe it's being driven principally by political objectives, and indeed his Deputy National Security Advisor at the start of his second term said that it was their intention for an Iranian nuclear deal to be the Obamacare of the second term. I think he meant that as a compliment. And part and parcel of how they have been implementing, exactly, part and parcel of how they've been implementing their lawlessness has been circumventing Congress. And they have circumvented Congress over and over again. They have tried to end run federal law and the Constitution. And so the purpose of this letter was 47 senators came together to make clear that any deal that the president negotiates with Iran will not become binding law in the United States unless, A, it is submitted as a treaty to the Senate and ratified by two-thirds of the treaty, or B, it is passed into law by both houses of Congress and signed into law by the president, that those are the only mechanisms for creating binding law in the United States of America. And that letter was designed to try to prevent President Obama from continuing his efforts to end run Congress and end run the American people.
We saw the results of that immediately. Not only was there the usual liberal outrage, but also Obama and Kerry run off to the UN and say, basically, let's pass a resolution that ends the sanctions if this deal is halfway good enough, so that then America would be on their own if they tried to bring sanctions back.
Well, and that's one of the most damaging consequences of what the Obama administration is doing, is they have undermined the international consensus in favor of sanctions and actively worked to weaken America's position and strengthen Iran's position. At the end of the Obama administration, we look at the world, the wreckage caused by the Obama-Clinton foreign policy. We see America far, far weaker. We see the American president a laughingstock. We see Iran in resurgence and on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons. We see Russia and Putin aggressive and bellicose. We see China flexing its muscles. We see Venezuela oppressing its people. We see Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and ISIS all expanding, seizing countries, murdering children. And all of this is the direct fruit of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy of leading from behind. And you're right, they're now trying to go to the UN as yet another effort to end run Congress. That could be effective in weakening or eliminating the international sanctions. But part of what they're asserting, and this is actually something that Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif asserted, they're claiming that if the UN acts, that it will bind the United States of America, and they're really seeking to bind the hands of the president who succeeds Barack Obama. On that, President Obama and Iran are every bit as wrong as they were with regard to the notion the president could just unilaterally negotiate an agreement that would bind a subsequent president. The UN Security Council has no authority, zero, to bind the United States of America or to create any law that has force or effect here in the United States. And I would note this is a question with which I am intimately familiar, because a number of years ago I litigated the case of Medellin versus Texas before the U.S. Supreme Court. I was the Solicitor General of Texas, the chief lawyer for the state of Texas in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and the central question in that case was whether the United Nations had the authority to bind the United States of America. And Texas argued it did not. We prevailed before the U.S. Supreme Court. We won 6-3, and the Supreme Court held, number one, that the United Nations has no authority to bind this country, and number two, that the President of the United States cannot unilaterally give away U.S. sovereignty to the United Nations.
Now, one of the things that we're seeing, however, Senator, and we are talking with Senator Ted Cruz, Republican from the Republic of Texas, soon to be here.
But I like the Republican from New Hampshire. I appreciate the kind sentiments of brotherly love.
I assure you that the activists are very interested in learning more about you.
Yeah. My question is, though, have the Republicans played a big role with the Democrats in enlarging the executive branch that Obama can get away, or any other president can get away with saying, I have, the quintessential pen, keyboard, and phone, and do pretty much what he wants, because we're seeing the irrelevancy of Congress in not being able to do anything, partly due to Obama's own actions, but also with the fecklessness of the GOP leadership. So my question is, if you become the president, if you so run to be the president, what kind of actions would you take? Would you continue on with an imperial presidency, or would you start to bring Congress back up to where it's a co-equal branch?
Right. That is a tremendously important question, and you are absolutely right. Republicans have been complicit in much of what has happened. Indeed, I mentioned a few minutes ago the case of Medellin versus Texas. The president, who in that case tried to assert the unilateral power to order the state courts to obey the world court, that president, unfortunately, was George W. Bush, a Texan, a Republican, and a friend. And nonetheless, the state of Texas went before the U.S. Supreme Court, and I personally argued before the court, arguing that President George W. Bush had no constitutional authority to undermine the sovereignty of the United States of America. And the Supreme Court agreed 6-3 and struck down his order. Now,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's crucially important, not just for the nuke deal, but for the fact that this administration in particular keeps trying to give away the store to the rest of the world with respect to global warming.
Look, you are absolutely right. They are zealots when it comes to global warming, and they are utterly uninterested in the science. Every time the science contradicts their cockamamie theory, they disregard the science and the evidence, because this is at the end of the day about government power and money rather than actually following the science and the data. So every time you listen to the hysteria about global warming and you ask a simple question, what about the fact that satellite data demonstrate there has been zero recorded warming in the last 17 years? Computer models all say the warming should be through the roof. The satellite data demonstrate there has been none whatsoever. The advocates of more and more government power to correct this supposed threat, they have no answer to that other than they start foaming at the mouth and accusing you of being a, quote, denier for actually turning and looking to the scientific facts. And in that regard, integral to that effort is undermining our sovereignty and empowering foreign bodies such as the United Nations and the World Court to try to diminish the constitutional rights of American citizens. But the question a minute ago was also absolutely right about who has borne responsibility for this imperial presidency. First and foremost, it has to be President Obama himself, who is the most lawless president we have ever seen. Secondly, I would point to Democratic members of the United States Senate, every single one of whom has remained silent while the president has usurped the constitutional authority of Congress. But third, unfortunately, has been a great many Republicans in Congress who have occasionally given a speech or rattled a saber, but have generally been unwilling to use the constitutional checks and balances given the Congress to rein in an imperial presidency. You know, for the last 2 years, I was the ranking member on the Constitution Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we put out a series of reports on the lawlessness of the Obama administration. Anyone interested can go to cruz.senate.gov, and you can read 5 different reports cataloging at great deal the lawlessness. So your question, the final question, there were several you asked, but the final one you asked is, if I were elected president, would I continue this pattern of lawlessness, this imperial presidency? Absolutely not. We need the President of the United States, first and foremost, to honor the Constitution, to carry out the constitutional responsibilities given to the President, and not to undermine the vital protections on our liberty that are embodied within the Constitution.
A follow-on question to that, Senator Cruz. In a lot of cases, it isn't even the top folks in the executive branch or Congress that are actually doing the ruling, but it is the agencies themselves. We look at the FCC right now, who have just in secret passed that 300-page internet takeover. Nobody knows what's in it. It just got released on Friday, but we see this happening in agency after agency. How can we stop this when the politicians always change? They come, they leave, they go away, but the bureaucracy stays. What is a solution for that?
Look, that is another very, very important question. There is right now a permanent government that is the unelected bureaucracy, the fourth estate. And this fourth branch of government, their view is they're there forever. They will outlast any politician who is at best or at worst a temporary annoyance. And so much of governing has been handed over to unelected bureaucrats, handed over with the eager complicity of Congress, because one of the advantages politically of handing policymaking over to unelected bureaucrats is it lets politicians avoid accountability. You don't have to look your constituents in the eye and say, I'm the one who voted to take away your job. Instead, you say, well, look, it was the EPA who did it. You know, what could I help with the consequence of this rule that makes no sense and costs tens of thousands of people their jobs? What can I help? They did it instead of me. So your question is, what can we do about it? It is fabulously important, especially because, and this is for anyone who's a constitutional conservative, we are all frustrated. When Democrats are in power, government power and size and spending and debt all grow phenomenally. But the Republicans are in power. Government size and spending and power and debt continues to grow. It just grows a little bit more slowly. And it seems a one-way ratchet where we never actually turn it around and start shrinking government and expanding human liberty. If I decide and launch a campaign to run for president, if I were elected president, it would be a powerful thing to see a president of the United States use the full Article II authorities given to the president to rein in the executive branch. What President Obama has done that's wrong is that he is infringing on the Article I authorities of Congress. He's trying to make laws, and the president doesn't have the authority to make laws. That's given to Congress, and the president gets a signature or a veto. But what the president does have authority over is Article II, executing the laws, that he has a responsibility to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And much of the regulatory state has been adopted by Congress trying to strip the president of those powers and tie his hands. It is my hope that the next president of the United States will use his constitutional authority not just to grow the regulatory state a little more slowly, but to actively begin reducing the morass of regulations that are strangling small businesses, that are destroying jobs, that are stripping away individual liberty. And we have never to date seen a president with the willingness and commitment to use his constitutional authority to rein in the regulatory state. My hope is, come January 2017, that will change.
Senator, that's Mike. So one of the problems that we've had in this republic is that power has constantly moved towards the center. What concrete proposal do you have, or what would you do if elected, to restore the balance in this republic to the states, as it is in fact a government of, by, and for the people, the states, and towards the center, not the other way around?
Right. Look, you're exactly right there as well. We have seen a constant move towards centralization of power. I am an emphatic defender of federalism. I am an emphatic believer in the 10th Amendment. Indeed, when I was in college, my senior thesis in college was on the 9th and 10th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Before I was elected to the Senate, I led the Center for 10th Amendment Studies at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. The 10th Amendment, as you know, is the final amendment in the Bill of Rights, and it provides that the powers not given to the federal government nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states and to the people. It's a fundamental restatement of the premise underlying the entire Constitution, which is that our federal government is a government of enumerated powers. And if the powers are not found in Article I, Section 8 of the Constitution, they are not given to Congress. One very specific manifestation of this, education. The federal government has no authority to be in the business of setting the curriculum that is taught to students across this country. That is one of the reasons why I'm passionately opposed to Common Core. Common Core is a vehicle that is being used to put us on a path to usurping control over curricula, over basic educational decisions, taking them out of the local school boards and putting them in the hands of unelected bureaucrats in Washington. We need leadership in Washington to turn that process around. Number one, to repeal every word of Common Core, which I have committed to do. Number two, as we talked about just a minute ago, using the Article II authority of the president to rein in the regulatory state. Number three, one of the areas of greatest oppression we see is through federal tax law, and in particular the IRS. There are right now more words in the IRS code than there are in the entire Bible. And not a one of them is as good, I might add. The consequence of that, the IRS code is one of the most frequent areas for crony capitalism, for favoritism, for the federal government increasing its power. It's why I have long advocated moving to a simple flat tax and abolishing the IRS, literally shutting it down so that every American can fill out his or her taxes on a simple postcard. Those are all solid, concrete steps, but what it takes fundamentally is a president committed to the Constitution and principles of federalism, to keeping the federal government out of the policy areas that should be at the state level or even better at the local level.
Senator, I always like to ask senators this question because I think it's pretty important to the nature of the republic on the whole. Would you support or do you support repeal of the 17th Amendment? And if it was to be repealed, how do you think that would affect the money and power politics in D.C.?
You know, it's a good question. There is a very good argument that the 17th Amendment helped set the stage for the expansion of federal power and the power of Washington. It used to be when you have senators selected by state legislatures, that provided an inherent check and balance on the power of the federal government, because after all, if a bunch of senators go and try to raid the authority of the state legislatures who appointed them, they're quite literally biting the hand that feeds them, and that was an important structural check on the size and power of the federal government. So I think the theoretical arguments against ever having adopted the 17th Amendment are quite strong. That being said, as a practical matter, I don't think there is any foreseeable world in which the 17th Amendment would be repealed. It is exceptionally difficult to urge a populace to vote to limit their own suffrage, and once the direct election of senators has been adopted by the people, I don't see any realistic possibility of that being changed. And so my view is, when we're talking about constitutional amendments, there are amendments that are far better expenditure of time and effort. I would put front and foremost a balanced budget amendment, a strong balanced budget amendment. I would put right alongside that a term limits amendment, which I think is critically important, and I think there's strong popular support. I would put also what's called the Madison Amendment, which is an amendment that would allow state legislatures directly to propose the specific text of a constitutional amendment. And I would also put there a variety of versions of what have been called regulatory freedom amendments to limit the regulatory authority of the federal government. All of those I would place as a higher priority, both because they would go right to the core of the problems we're facing and because I think there's a far greater likelihood of actually having those amendments adopted and becoming part of the Constitution.
Okay, and the final question, Senator, is the how. You're the president, you have the best ideas. How do you persuade Congress to go along with effectively limiting their own power to some extent, or putting responsibility back on their shoulders to some extent?
Well, that also is a fundamental question, and the only way to change the direction of this country, the only way to persuade Congress, is we have to change the rules of Congress. If we continue to operate as Congress has, with decisions made in Washington in smoke-filled rooms, we won't turn things around. And so what I've been trying to do, and the only way I think we can do it, is go over the heads of Congress, go directly to the American people. And I draw an analogy. Thank you, sir. I'll draw an analogy. Imagine this were 1979. And imagine you were talking with Ronald Reagan. And Reagan were on this blog program. You'd probably be wondering what a blog program was. But nonetheless, imagine Reagan told you in 1979 that he's going to come into office and we're going to cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% all the way down to 28%. Imagine Reagan continued to say, we're going to take the current stagnation. At the time in 79, the United States was trapped in what became a 4-year period where we averaged less than 1% growth a year. Imagine Reagan said, within 4 years, by 1984, the economy will be growing at 7.2% a year, booming economic growth, which is going to lift millions of people out of poverty into prosperity, into the middle class, into a better life. And imagine if Reagan also said, our hostages that are right now languishing in the nation of Iran, those hostages will be released the day I am sworn in, and within a decade we will win the Cold War without firing a shot, and we will tear the Berlin Wall to the ground. Now, to be honest, you would have told Reagan he was off as a rocker, that none of those were possible in Washington. If you went and talked to the committee chairs in Washington, the Democrats and the Republicans, almost to a person, They found every one of those to be ludicrous. But yet what Reagan did in 1980, he didn't get on a plane and fly to Washington and try to convince a bunch of old graybeards in committee rooms. Instead, he took the case to the American people. He took the case to the American people, and we saw a grassroots movement come together that became the Reagan Revolution. And it was so powerful from the people that it ended up unifying. It unified Republicans, and it brought Democrats on board, because when the people spoke with one voice in support of liberty, Washington had to listen. I believe we're at a similar inflection point today. I think there are uncanny similarities between Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, and I believe the election in 2016 is going to be an election very, very much like 1980. So your question was, how do we persuade Congress to limit the power of the federal government to do bold, audacious things that are critically important, like repealing every word of Obamacare, like repealing Common Core, like abolishing the IRS? Listen, none of those are anywhere near as bold and audacious as what Reagan accomplished. And the way we do it is the exact same. We take the case to the American people, and with a grassroots tsunami coming from the people, that's how we win the election in 2016. But even more importantly, that's how, with that popular support, we get Washington to act. We plain and simple, make the political costs of doing the wrong thing higher than the political costs of doing the right thing.
Well, Senator, thank you so much for taking some time with us today. I believe we're going to see you tomorrow at an event in Stratford. So we hope to see you then. We can catch up on some more news. Thanks so much for taking time to talk to us.
Well, terrific. I enjoyed it. It was a good conversation. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
All righty. You have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. That actually worked out really well. We got about 20 seconds before we have to start the end of the show. And it was great to have him on. Good questions, good answers.
I think so, and I think he sees himself as being able to take on the mantle of the great communicator, because that's what you have to do. You have to be able to speak convincingly to the American people and get them to pressure Congress. And he's right. You can't just take the president to Congress and hope to twist enough arms. It won't work.
Nope, absolutely right. All right, well, next tomorrow, I guess, we're going to be broadcasting or attempting to broadcast from the Cruz event, which is called
Stratford County Chili and Chat with Senator Cruz.
Well, it's got chili, so I'm going to want to go. And hopefully the weather will accommodate us, and we'll be able to get there and get all set up. So we'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Yeah, baby.